And now our special guest this evening is Ed Halliwell. Ed Halliwell leads public mindfulness courses, workshops, and retreats in person in Sussex and globally via Zoom, and has introduced and taught mindfulness in more than 60 organizations, including the Royal Society, the NHS, the Cabinet Office, and the Houses of Parliament. He is author of 3 books: Into the Heart of Mindfulness, Mindfulness Made Easy, and The Mindful Manifesto. Ed supervises mindfulness teachers for the Mindfulness Network and has been leading one-to-one mindfulness mentoring sessions for several years. And I will pop his website into the chat as well. And I will now pass it over to Ed. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda, and really warm welcome to everyone. It's so lovely to see you all here this evening. Thank you for coming. My understanding is that it's traditional, and I think it's appropriate in a session like this to start with a few minutes of mindfulness practice. So I'd just like to invite you to join me in taking a pause, and in whatever posture suits you, and whether you want to have your eyes open or closed, just to drop into being mode for a few moments. Inviting you to notice what's present here at the moment for you in your body and mind. And seeing if what's here can be met with a quality of friendliness and interest. There may be stuff floating around in your body and mind, perhaps related to anticipation of what might happen here this evening, or perhaps completely or seemingly unrelated. So if you'd like to, you might like to anchor your attention perhaps to the sensations of breathing, or another place in the body that you'd like to drop into. And now perhaps expanding to an open awareness, just allowing what's here to be present, receiving experience as it arrives and dissolves moment by moment, just letting be. Now, if you have had your eyes closed, you might like to open them and expand your view to see your screen and who's here, and just to get a bit of a sense of the environment here. And of course, knowing that we can come back to ground at any point. Yeah. So it's a real delight to be with you this evening, and to have the opportunity to share with you a little bit about one-to-one mindfulness mentoring as an approach to sharing mindfulness-based approaches. So it's been actually a really a kind of interesting process to reflect on what I might say this evening, and put a little bit of order perhaps on something that I've been offering and working on and with people on over a number of years, and also that we've been having conversations about in the mindfulness network. Some of us who are supervisors who also have offered themselves as mentors. So these conversations have been happening amongst us to really kind of begin to perhaps get a sense of what this is. And so what I've ended up with is a series of questions that I posed to myself, and which I'm going to attempt to answer for, well, initially was for myself, but also now for you, to perhaps put a bit of a flesh on this idea of, what is mindfulness mentoring? What is one-to-one mindfulness mentoring? So I'm just going to put these questions, or at least the first one of them, up on the screen behind me, just to frame the different topics that I'm going to cover here. So let's just see if I can do that. Okay, so here we go. Magically, here's number one above me. So hopefully you can see this. If someone lets me know if this isn't coming across and it's not there, otherwise I'll assume it is. So question number one: could one-to-one mindfulness mentoring expand our options for the effective transmission of mindfulness-based approaches to living? Whilst, as I say, some of us at the Mindfulness Network have been offering this and have been talking about this for a little while, I think it's fair to say that up until now, the main focus for teaching mindfulness in kind of what we might call MBAs, mindfulness-based approaches, the focus has been on group teaching and the group experience for teaching and learning mindfulness, and for really good reasons, which I'll come to in a moment. However, I'd like to suggest that there are also some really good reasons to suggest that groups may not always be the optimum way of sharing mindfulness with people, and that there may be other formats that might support people to develop their personal practice, their mindfulness practice, and in bringing their mindfulness to the everyday issues of their lives, and actually also how this can maybe expand beyond just the delivery of, say, an 8-week course. And I know that's been happening in lots of forms already in groups, such as graduate courses and practice groups and so on. But I think that one-to-one work is an area that perhaps hasn't had the same kind of focus. And I think there are situations, particularly where for people, perhaps groups aren't the most helpful format for them to learn in. And also times are changing. So maybe having some innovations and adaptations that might enable mindfulness to be shared as widely as possible in these times might be helpful. And I want to be really clear also that this is not intended to be something instead of mindfulness teaching in groups, but something that could be offered alongside as another option for some people. Okay, so that's what I'd like to explore. So question number two then: why are mindfulness courses usually taught in groups? Well, first of all, the group teaching format for meditation is very common in wisdom traditions. So it's not uncommon to find in Buddhist communities that you have a sort of a format where a teacher will lead a meditation session with a group of people, whether that's on a course or on a retreat, or in a practice center. And so we kind of inherited that model as one very common way of meditation being taught. It's probably a sort of a common image, seeing the sort of teacher and then a sort of a meditation room full of students in front of them. So we've inherited this way of doing things. So it's not perhaps surprising that we've drawn, just as we've drawn from many other kind of Buddhist-inspired models, this particular model of teaching. It's also really efficient in many ways. So when you have a group working with a single teacher or a few teachers, lots of people can learn mindfulness at once. So there's in very purely economic terms, it's a maximum spread at a minimum cost, which obviously makes it very attractive in many places, particularly say in the NHS, where cost efficiency is an important consideration for what approaches become accepted and used. It's not only efficient, but it's also in many cases really effective. So sharing the challenges of mindfulness training, the common difficulties that people encounter, and also sharing the insights that can come up when people start practicing meditation. These can really facilitate the learning process. We can learn from what another person says in the group. And also we can start to see the human condition and the human patterns of reactivity in others, and see perhaps that our challenges when we come as a member of a group to look for how mindfulness might help us, to see that we're not alone. That one of the great discoveries of mindfulness training is seeing how actually we all experience difficulties, and we all have the possibilities of working with those skillfully. The processes that meditation facilitates can be common to all of us, and so we can find that we move out perhaps of isolation and into a sense of community when we're in a group together. So these processes are common to us all, they don't necessarily need to be individually tailored. So we've all got an autopilot mode. We all have biases in our cognition. These can lead us, all of us, to act unskillfully sometimes, act out of habit. And we can all learn perhaps to notice more and begin to let go of these habits little by little by practicing staying present. So actually the individual circumstances of what's going on in our lives doesn't necessarily need to be addressed individually to understand and to work with these processes. We can just learn together as human beings, together, without necessarily sharing the kind of the minutiae of our individual lives on a mindfulness course. And indeed that's somewhat discouraged on a mindfulness course to kind of move into what we sometimes might call narrative mode, telling the stories of our lives. We focus very much on the experience and what's coming up in the present moment in the practice, and what's coming up at home when we practice. So it can be a really powerful communal support container. The energy of the room, of people working together for a common purpose, can be really very influential. Also, teaching in groups with perhaps a set curriculum, because it's quite a structured approach, it's also very replicable. So if a curriculum works and a process seems to work, then that can be shared with other groups, and the curriculum can be shared, and the approach can be shared. The model can transfer, and potentially we're reaching, many people, as has happened indeed with programs such as MBSR and MBCT. I don't know if there are any figures for how many people those programs have been taught to, but my guess is it would be in the hundreds of thousands now around the world, at least. So it's a really great way of sharing principles, basic principles, widely. And I want to be really clear, I love working with groups. And still teach 8-week courses and graduate groups and graduate courses, and I love that sense of vibrancy and energy that can come from being in a group of people meditating and working on themselves together. However, I also think there are some drawbacks at times. The focus on these common human processes and the deliberate, if you like, non-tailoring to personal circumstances means that to some degree, people are left to discover for themselves in a course what's relevant for them and to experiment. And if that goes well, it can go really, really well. But I have noticed that sometimes people are left with questions which they don't seem to find the answer to on a group course. You know, what do I do in this specific situation? How can mindfulness help me with this particular relationship issue? With this particular tendency for me to get anxious on this particular subject. How can I bring more mindfulness to my work? These situations which are not which we deliberately don't pay attention to. They may come up in inquiry, of course, but they're likely to only get a small amount of attention paid to them. We apply the general processes of mindfulness to the group and trust that people can find ways to implement these in their lives. Also, some people may be working with very specific issues around the conditions that they might have. So, for example, some people might be working with anxiety, some people with depression, some people with obsessive compulsive disorder, some people might be working with pain, with addictive behaviors, with grief, with ADHD, all number of possible, so-called clinical conditions, or many of them clinical conditions. That they might bring into the group. And of course, I know that there are also many groups, mindfulness groups, that will address those particular conditions, and that's really helpful. But sometimes a group process may not touch those kinds of processes, which might be very deeply ingrained. So specific situations and specific patterns that might come up for somebody again and again, where perhaps those general principles, although they're completely applicable, the experience of the group might not quite land. That's what I've noticed. Partly because there just isn't the space to go into them in detail and depth. Some people may be working with insomnia, somebody else with bursts of anger outbursts, or an unhealthy relationship with food. And whilst we might get the common processes that underpin that, that may not always be enough to help them address the specifics of those kinds of situations. This is one reason why I think that the groups don't always meet the full need of those kinds of situations. Also, in a group, there are occasions where I've noticed people miss the relevance of the group, of the common processes that we're talking about, or find themselves unable to apply it. So it's not unusual that I've heard sometimes at the end of a course, or even kind of after someone has taken several mindfulness courses, for someone to say to me, well, it took a really long time for me to realize that I was still striving to attain a state of relaxation in meditation, despite the whole course being about letting go of that. It's amazing what we can miss because of our blind spots and perhaps misconceptions about what mindfulness and meditation is. We're trying to achieve a state of calm, understandably, because we all want to feel calm and relaxed. Or we continue to judge ourselves about being successful or not at the practice. And sometimes the kind of like the presentation of mindfulness in a group can sometimes mean that these can kind of wash over people. I've noticed that. There are also some people who feel uncomfortable working in a group, or actually isn't their optimum learning environment. And we know that there are some occasions where we kind of look out for that when we're offering an orientation to a mindfulness course. If someone's experienced a level of social anxiety where actually the group itself is going to lead them to feel stressed, that's probably not going to be an optimum environment for them to learn in. Whereas someone like that might actually benefit from being in a one-to-one situation. They may feel that they can be safe enough with one person that they trust, in a way that they might not be safe or feel safe rather with a group of people. So actually people can sometimes feel isolated in groups. They can feel different, they can feel awkward. So while for many of us the group environment is nurturing, for some people it is actually very depleting. And when we're depleted, it's difficult to learn. So often then the processes and practices of the course don't perhaps land. Sometimes the needs of the group and an individual in the group can also be in conflict. So I've sometimes had the experience as a teacher that whilst the group, the curriculum and the process of say an 8-week course is valuable for the group, that sometimes there might be someone in the group for whom actually I have the inclination that something quite specific and different might be needed at that moment than what we're doing. Maybe they don't need a working with difficulty practice just this evening. Maybe it would be good for one person really to be anchoring now, while somewhere else might benefit from an open awareness practice. And of course, when you have a set curriculum in a group, it's not possible to tailor in that way, because of course the needs of the group is what's most important. So yeah, a few occasions when a mindfulness course might not be, or a group course might not be helpful. Of course, there's also the perennial issue of what happens when a course ends. So when that container dissolves, we sometimes call it the cliff edge issue. You get to the end of an 8 weeks and suddenly your support and your container and your group is taken away, and the individual is left to find their own way forwards. Now, hopefully people can find their way forwards, whether it's in follow-up groups or whether it's in connecting with their own group, continuing to meet perhaps, or finding a follow-on course. But not everyone does this. Quite often people will lose the structure of the container and find themselves somewhat lost at the end of that. And I would suggest that really to embed change in the way that change can happen with a long-term mindfulness practice, more than 8 weeks is needed. So group courses can create that foundation, but if the group then dissolves after 8 weeks, maybe it needs something else to help people sustain their practice beyond that point. Okay, so next question that I formulated here: how can one-to-one mindfulness mentoring address some of these challenges? Oh, no, actually, the other thing I didn't mention on the last one is the kind of like the set time and place of the course. So people have to be available, at the same times every week, and not everybody is able to do that. So one-to-one can offer that time and place convenience, in that the time and place is agreed with the mentor and the mentee, and could be adjusted as needed, week by week or month by month. And that includes the frequency of meeting, the length of meetings, as well as the time of day. Another advantage is that we can, in a one-to-one session, we can zoom in on a particular personal process. We can look at a specific habit pattern, say, and spend more time exploring, teasing out, looking at, understanding the process of those habit patterns, or whatever it is that someone is finding as a block or an obstacle for them. And we can also tailor the practices and the responses that we might want to suggest that the person brings to that particular person in that moment. So if they do, if they are, perhaps they might benefit from, a greater degree of grounding, then we can practice, mindfulness of breathing, or mindfulness of attending to the feet or the hands, If someone actually could benefit from opening out their perspective, then we might practice an open awareness practice with them. Or if what they need is cultivating a sense of safety, it might be a safe space meditation from the MBCL course, or a compassionate friend meditation if they perhaps are not in touch with their wise, compassionate self that they could find. So different practices can be brought in at different times for different people, according to the need, according to the stage of practice, according to the phase they're in at that moment. And these could be quite different for different people. I remember, I think it was one of Jack Cornfield's teachers was talking about how, sometimes teaching mindfulness is a bit like steering from one side of the road to the other. Maybe the intention is to find ourselves in the middle of the road, but sometimes we might need to steer left because somebody is over to the right-hand side of the road. And sometimes we might need to steer right because someone's on the left-hand side, in order to be able to come into balance. So actually very different invitations might be offered to different people at different times. And so a one-to-one approach can really address that. Some people might need a greater sense of regularity and discipline if their lives and their practice is somewhat chaotic. For some people, actually, if rigidity is an issue, it might need more letting go, more allowing. And of course, trauma sensitivity can be really worked in a one-to-one approach as well, and perhaps being able to hear and speak with and understand a person's personal process more deeply and individually may help a mindfulness teacher to support people who are working perhaps with trauma in their background. There's also flexibility in terms of curriculum. So a session can be responsive to the mentee's needs, not just in terms of what practice, but what might we draw from. So as I say, sometimes I might draw from the MBCL program or the Feeling Tone program, or it might be from mindful communication, insight dialogue or nonviolent communication. I think my favorite sort of 3-word definition of mindfulness comes from the MBCT for Life program. It's an appropriate response. What does this moment need? And if we're working one-to-one with someone, the possibility of actually tuning into that need that's completely focused on that other person can allow skillful options to be presented and flexible options to be presented that's not possible in a typical group 8-week course. Also, in a one-to-one session, some people are much more willing to share their circumstances. They may not have the kind of vulnerability that they might sense in a group. So sometimes a really kind of deep and authentic connection can be made between two people in a way that might not be possible when there's a group. And this depth in itself, in my experience, can be very healing when someone feels supported and heard and loved, with 100% of attention on them. So yeah, greater depth, perhaps an environment of trust for some people who might be vulnerable in groups. And then the power of repetition, of being able to meet over and over again on a one-to-one basis with this focus and a careful holding of just the one person, I think can really contribute to flourishing over time. So the quality of attention, the degree of attention, the depth of attention that can happen in a one-to-one session can sometimes be very beneficial. And of course, the approach itself is relational. So it is in some sense an insight dialogue in itself. The meeting of two people and the sharing of the space and the seeing what comes up in that space. Indeed, there's something very mindful, I would suggest, about the spontaneity that's possible in a one-to-one session, of coming with, John Kabat-Zinn, sometimes likes to talk about MBSR as the empty curriculum. well, this really can be an empty curriculum in the sense that it can draw from all sorts of different possible frameworks, but really choosing how we might work together in the moment, in the connection of the mentor and the mentee, working together to see what might be needed moment by moment. Okay, so move on to the fifth question of my 10 here. How am I doing for time? Not too bad. Okay, good. So just want to say a little bit about how I came to begin to offer mindfulness mentoring. How did this evolve for me? So just very briefly to say, how I came to mindfulness practice, which was about just over 20 years ago. So I was in my late 20s and I'd experienced a number of episodes of anxiety and depression throughout my 20s. And I really hit a big one of these at the age of about 27, 28, which actually led to almost 3 years of severe daily anxiety and rumination, which hugely affected my functioning. It came with it depression because it was a highly unpleasant state to be in, and I desperately wanted to get out of it. So I found myself in this spiral of anxiety, really not understanding why or indeed how I might emerge from it. And indeed, actually, my attempts to emerge from it were what kept me in them in the end. So the ways that I was trying to escape, to avoid my experience, to separate myself from what was going on in my mind and body. Of course, likely be familiar with this as mindfulness practice, which is this is likely to keep that experience of anxiety and depression going, which is exactly what happened. I attempted all sorts of different approaches. I went to weekly psychotherapy. I went to support groups. I was taking various different kinds of antidepressants. Alternative therapies of various kinds, and I did endless reading on psychology, and none of this interrupted the cycle. What did eventually help to interrupt the cycle was mindfulness meditation. When a few different people actually suggested, I think you could benefit from learning to meditate, Ed. So eventually I took that heed and found myself at a local Buddhist center. There were no 8-week mindfulness courses at this point in the UK. For the first time, I was taught to, follow my breath and observe thoughts and emotions as if in the background of my awareness. And this was the first time that I was really taught to decenter from my experience of what was going on within me, rather than either being consumed by it or desperately trying to avoid it. And I could immediately see the value in this. So it was the first time I was able to practice watching my experience, seeing its patterns, step outside of those in some way and bring awareness to them. So I really felt very, very early on that there was some gold in this. And it struck me that this wasn't something that I was taught how to do in any of the other environments that I had been seeking help. I suspect I would these days, of course, a lot of therapists and a lot of medical environments are now, mindfulness aware. But at the time, it struck me that here was something really, really valuable that all my seeking and all the support had not given me. And that's kind of stayed with me, this was the kind of the kernel and the core of my recovery, which took a long time to sort of start taking shape. It's still ongoing, of course, but gradually I experienced more times of remission, a sense of greater agency in my life, and a deeper degree of peace and contentment as time has gone on, in amidst all the ups and downs of living. And so what really kind of as I kind of saw that little bit of gold in meditation practice, I really began to immerse myself in Buddhist training. So kind of surrounding myself with programs and courses and reading and retreats where I was exposed to the kind of realities of impermanence, of interdependence, letting go of the concept of a fixed self, observing the power of cause and effect, and of making different choices, of letting go of attachment, seeing the processes of aversion and how they lead to the kind of the second arrow effect of making things worse, and how bringing an approach of kindness and gentleness could be really salutary. And that both really resonated with me, and it began to make a difference to my life and to my experience. So this led over time to making some shifts in my life, and this is how I ended up becoming a mindfulness teacher. So I was a journalist at the time. I moved my writing gradually into the mental health field, and worked with the Mental Health Foundation on developing a report on mindfulness. That led me to encounter MBCT and MBSR, and to train at a Bangor and to begin a mindfulness teaching practice. So this was I've kind of condensed here, 10 years into a couple of minutes. But what stayed with me about all of that time was how it was the principles and the practices of mindfulness that had led to the changes that I'd experienced in my life. And it also struck me that I kind of had to go outside of the mainstream of society to reach that, to find that. And I was wondering, why aren't people introduced to this more generally and more readily? It seemed like a kind of secret that only a few people had. And particularly my experiences of one-to-one work, say in psychotherapy, didn't seem to have that quality to them. So when I started teaching mindfulness, I stayed very much within the group teaching format, but I also had a strong sense that an 8-week course could only be a beginning. So I would offer group practice sessions here at in Sussex, where I'm based. I began teaching weekend retreats, and 5-day retreats, and follow-on courses, some of which will be familiar with, like say MBCL and Deepening, taking it further course that's offered by the Oxford Centre, but also theming these graduate sessions and theming follow-on courses along the lines of some of the kind of underlying principles and practices of mindfulness that have been really valuable to me. So, impermanence, interconnectedness, sometimes on areas such as mindful communication. So, connecting with values. What I found is that sometimes in kind of cultivating this kind of approach that went beyond an 8-week course, sometimes people would ask me, say, well, do you see people one-to-one? And I did sometimes see people one-to-one, but usually it was taking them through a curriculum, like MBSR or MBCT on a one-to-one basis. But I tended to find sometimes people would want to come and say, like, I've got this specific issue that I'm working with, or I could really value talking to you about my mindfulness practice, and there isn't space to do this in the group. So I began to say yes to those requests, and I was a little bit nervous about it, to be honest, because I'm not a therapist, and it wasn't necessarily part of my training as a mindfulness teacher, which had all been about leading groups. But I did have the support of my supervisor, and gradually I began to become more confident about what could be offered on a one-to-one basis, especially as people reported finding it useful, of wanting to come back for a number of sessions. And so this has gradually grown over the years. And then in 2017, I became a supervisor with the Mindfulness Network, and fairly soon after that, mindfulness mentoring or personal practice mentoring, as it's sometimes called, became a thing that was offered by the Mindfulness Network. And we got together as a group, those of us who were offering that, to talk about the experience, to see if we could find, some shape of what it is that we were offering, and, share together whether, what we were finding helpful, and to really kind of begin to get a sense of what this is as a thing. This, whether we call it personal practice mentoring or mindfulness mentoring or one-to-one mindfulness work. And what I found is that in recent years, this part of the work that I do has grown more and more. So I think probably in 2017 I might have been seeing 3 or 4 people on a reasonably regular one-to-one basis, and I sort of did a little reflection count, on the last couple of months, and now I see around 15 people for mindfulness mentoring, different frequencies, probably an average of twice a month. And sometimes this is quite short-term work, and there are a few people that I've been seeing on a regular basis for a number of years. And I'm going to share with you a little bit in a little bit kind of what people have reported, because I'd like them to have a voice, because I can't really tell you the participant experience myself, but I can tell you what people have told me. So this is how this has evolved for me, having found kind of deficits in my experience of one-to-one work, of noticing drawbacks sometimes. And by the way, there's also huge advantages in one-to-one therapy. I'm absolutely not kind of like denigrating other one-to-one approaches. I'm just saying my experience was that what mindfulness training offered me was something that really resonated with me more than anything else. And that maybe there have been some limitations in what happens in groups. Okay, so question number 6 then: what frameworks can one-to-one mindfulness mentoring draw on? What actually distinguishes this as an approach? Now, this is very much up for discussion. In fact, the whole thing here that I'm presenting is very much up for discussion. I'm really aware that this is just my kind of perspective. And that we don't really have a field as yet, but maybe this can be a contribution to that happening amongst groups of people, including all of you who are here. It seems to me that we have a incredibly rich background to draw on. We've got, thousands of years of Buddhist psychology and phenomenology to draw on. We've got 45 years of research, of scientific research at least, on mindfulness-based approaches that informs how we run groups. Of course, that's another reason why groups are sustaining as well, because they have this very strong evidence base and research base to back them up. I also think there are other kind of aligned approaches that we can draw on that can, in my experience, really enhance mindfulness mentoring sessions. So I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. So for me, mindfulness mentoring, this isn't quite a definition, but I will read out what I've written here. So I've written mindfulness mentoring is a one-to-one approach to understanding the reality of our minds, bodies, and environment, based on paying attention to how these present themselves in our conscious life experience, and learning how to attend to and relate to them in a way that leads to the greatest possible fulfillment, agency, meaning, and loving kinship for ourselves, others, and the world. Now, you might say, well, isn't that a definition of mindfulness, apart from the one-to-one? And you'd be absolutely right, it is. And I think that's what really distinguishes perhaps a one-to-one mentoring approach from maybe other one-to-one approaches. That it is very specifically mindfulness-based. We have the principle that practice changes the brain and body and experience, and so there is work kind of to be engaged with, gentle work, of course, through meditation, that needs repetition so that our minds can influence their life context whilst recognizing, of course, that life context can influence our minds as well. So this kind of whole mind-body environmental process that can be influenced through paying attention and noticing and practicing. And so practice is a key element in mindfulness mentoring. That's not to say that sometimes it might take a background in a session. Sometimes we might do more inquiry and conversation. And sometimes a session might be completely practice. Somebody might say, I could really use dropping into a body scan today. How about we just do that? But certainly, I would say that mindfulness mentoring isn't mindfulness mentoring unless it has a practice base, and that any form of one-to-one work that doesn't include a practice base is not going to be mindfulness mentoring. So if it doesn't have that framework of working with reality through paying attention, with kindness, if it doesn't have the base of practice as key to the development that people can make through it, then it's not mindfulness mentoring. And if it does, then it could well be. There's often a question that comes up is like, well, what is the difference between mentoring and therapy? And we often have these conversations in the network group. Some of us are therapists, and some of us aren't. And it's certainly true that mentoring, in my opinion, can be therapeutic in the sense of relieving suffering, helping people cultivate healing through the application of methods of transformation. But it has to have those key elements to be mentoring. The key elements of a specifically mindfulness-based approach in the way that I've just described it, and specifically involving practice as a meditation practice, or certainly mindfulness practice in daily life as well as a key element. And if you're interested, there's actually a series of kind of bullet point definitions of what a mindfulness-based approach is that Rebecca Crane and colleagues kind of wrote down in their paper, what defines mindfulness-based programs, the warp and the weft, in 2017. I'm not going to read those out now because you can find them yourself, but I would say that those are the same qualities that need to be present in mindfulness mentoring too. And they're pretty much, that's an expanded version of what I've already said. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about what I've drawn on in my mentoring practice. And this will inevitably be somewhat individual because different mindfulness teachers will have trained in different approaches. So I'm not saying this is kind of how it should be, but just what has influenced me and what maybe sometimes might I bring to a mentoring session with a mentee. Well, certainly, having a background in contemplative practice and principles is absolutely core. So, I trained for probably the first 15 years of my practice in Buddhist traditions, although was somewhat with a reservation as to finding some of the aspects, if you like, the add-ons of if you like, religious approach not really suiting me, and finding myself then very, very drawn to an evidence-based phenomenological approach to mindfulness. So using the world and the environment as offering the principles of practice as well as a scientific evidence base. But this sort of diagnosis of the human condition that I believe is universal, is evident and testable, such as the observation that the mind is, a lot of suffering is created by the mind's futile attempt to maintain security and contentment by trying to keep things separate and steady in an inevitably impermanent world. That leads to resistance and rumination, the tendency to struggle with what's happening as we try to hold on to pleasure and avoid pain, and then get frustrated when we can't. These seem to me to be, self-evident from having worked with probably thousands of people in mindfulness courses. I see that again and again, and have experienced it in my own life again and again. So that seems to me like that it is testable and evidence-based. That things are continually changing. That the approach of bringing a heartfelt connection to sensory experience moment by moment with an intention to bring kind of a real equanimity and peace and contentment that aligns with reality, that is salutary and that enables human flourishing. That also, I believe, is testable. And that there are these specific methods to bring these about, that meditation and meditative approaches, not necessarily formal meditation, but meditative approaches can be a way of finding insight into the human condition, and also teaching us how we can be present to it and perhaps respond to it skillfully. All of these are kind of laid out in contemplative traditions, and I believe that they're also aligned with the scientific evidence as we know it. I also sometimes draw from other kind of people who've been in different wisdom traditions, poets, philosophers, teachers who've all spoken to this human reality, whether that might be Ruma, whether it might be Rilke, whether it might be Einstein or Mary Oliver or Dana Folds or whoever. I'm sure many of you are familiar with so much of the wonderful poetry that we can bring into teach us about life and about mindfulness. Of course, MBSR and MBCT, core practices like the body scan, mindful movement, breathing spaces, the application of psychological frameworks, the doing-driven mode and the being mode of mind, the four-part model of human experience of thoughts, emotions, body sensations, and impulses, the effect of nurturing and depleting activities on our daily life, the impact of stress, our cognitive and perceptual biases, attitudinal foundations of mindfulness that we might be able to bring to our experience. All of these can be brought into one-to-one mentoring. Other programs too, I've mentioned a few like MBCL, Mindful Self-Compassion, that bring in other practices that help us to soothe, perhaps understand and work with our emotion regulation systems, help us to develop compassion and insight. Mindful communication is another way of bringing our practice into the relational world. So there's a kind of a wide range of practices and processes, and also frameworks that are coming, all of the time are being added to, about understandings of how human minds operate. So for example, Lisa Feldman Barrett on how emotions can be constructed. Mark Williams's work on feeling tone and the frame by frame program. I'm been very struck by John Teasdale's book on how mindfulness happens. Really deeply understanding the modes of mind that can be that can lead to suffering and that can lead to joy and peace and awakening. And he kind of really using his model of what he calls interactive cognitive subsystems, which is really the two modes of mind and how they operate, and how we tend to default into the conceptual, into separating, into fixing, into trying to kind of avoid the difficult. Understanding of neuroplasticity, and how this can be self-directed through attentional practice. Understanding a little bit of the neuroscience can be really helpful, and how our brains, bodies, and minds can be rewired. Dan Siegel, for example, and how he writes about mind, brain, body integration, how wholeness, which is also a word that John Teasdale uses, how kind of being whole at a brain level, but also at an experiential level, tends to lead to harmony, to flexibility, rather than the rigidity and chaos that comes from kind of the sort of separatedness and being up in our heads. Another example would be Jeremy Lent's work on actually how we can see mindfulness in nature, how there are non-verbal intelligences in the natural world that kind of, employ a kind of a sort of embodiedness that seems to lead to harmony amongst environments, amongst animals, amongst plants, even, I think an example he uses is various forms of, whether it's algae or fungi, I'm not quite sure, but you'll have to read his work. And indeed also Ellen Langer, who talks about mindfulness, but in a somewhat different way, not particularly based on meditation, but on how paying attention to the context of our world can have a huge experience on what happens in us and our choices and behavior. So very famously, the counterclockwise study that she did, where she found that older people who were placed, into an environment which reminded them of some younger days, actually they started to feel and behave differently, to act and experience life in a more vibrant and vigorous way, even to the point of improving their eyesight. Can you believe? So this, I believe, totally aligns with a mindfulness-based approach, because we are not isolated. We are in our context. So paying attention to those contexts, and of course, those contexts are often they are unique to us. So this might not be easily addressed in a group course. In a one-to-one mentor, we might be able to pay attention very directly to the context that people are living in, and see how they may be influencing our experience, and to see how, with practice, we may be able to influence those and change those, so that transformation can come from within to without, but also from without to within. And there are some others as well. Ian McGilchrist's work on hemisphere specialization maps really nicely onto the doing driven and being modes. The field of positive psychology, Martin Seligman and Barbara Friedrichsen. ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy, which is very much a mindfulness-based approach to psychotherapy, and has some really useful principles and practices and exercises that can really support, I believe, the if you like, the more kind of standard mindfulness-based approaches that we teach in groups. So these are just a few, and they just happen to be ones that have influenced me. Stages of transformation that Ken Wilber talks about. Jack Cornfield talks about mindfulness as behaviorism with heart. So the sort of combination of, if you like, a CBT approach with a real sort of heartfelt embodied approach. I think with all of these aligning, and this is, the important thing is all of these, I believe, align with the core principles of mindfulness-based approaches, and so can be brought in skillfully to help people to find their way to live mindfully in their lives. And in my experience, one-to-one mentoring offers an opportunity for different aspects of these to be drawn in at different times, depending on when it's appropriate, alongside the many different practices. So I think sometimes we I think I mentioned sort of mindfulness for me as being a bit like discovering gold, and actually there's lots of analogies in history of awakening being described as finding like the gold under the floorboards, and I think in some ways we do this in the mindfulness field a bit. It's kind of like we have this gold, and we've kind of, if you like, kept it within, let's say it's not under the floorboards anymore, but it's in a room of mindfulness group interventions or approaches. And maybe it doesn't just have to stay in that room, but actually it could open out to the whole house, or indeed to the whole environment. And that gold could illuminate much more than just that room of group approaches. So, we've got this enormous richness here to draw on. And so I think, we can be confident that as long as we stay true to the principles and the practices of what mindfulness is, then it can extend out into new and different approaches, which is already happening in many, many fields. I know, I've done a lot of work with the Mindfulness Initiative and now have annual Mindfulness Innovations Awards. So this is already happening, but I think it could, an area that doesn't seem to have brought to light is in one-to-one work. Okay, so before I finish, I just want to give a voice to some people who have really generously agreed to share their experience for this session. So obviously, one-to-one work, like any other mindfulness work, has a confidentiality to it. So what I did is I asked my mentees if they would be willing to share some experience, to answer a few questions, and to describe their experience, and would they be willing for me to share that with you in this session? And many of them really kindly said yes. So if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read these out, and let them speak for themselves. I've got 6 of them, and I may not have time for all of them, but I think it's really important to hear from, if you like, the mentee's side, what mindfulness mentoring is. Okay, so here's person number 1. Whilst group courses such as the 8-week course have been great, I sometimes found the group environment too intense. I know many get great value from the group interactions. However, I find these really difficult. They hinder me from benefiting from the practice. The pinpointed nature of one-on-one is excellent. I wanted to explore my own practice, and in mindfulness mentoring, the flexible balance of talking and discussion, specific and targeted practice, together with guided suggestions for my own mindfulness practice between sessions, has been invaluable. Learning to observe through description with careful support and guidance has allowed me to find a deeper benefit for my practice and pinpoint where and how to use it. It's reduced the negativity in my life many times. The ability to build on areas over the medium term and keep returning to them has been really helpful. I've been deciding when to transition to a post-work or semi-retirement environment, and the one-on-one sessions have helped me to find the pathway and not be in a rush to execute. Difficult conversations have become easier and the objectives clearer. I really look forward to testing my observations in the one-on-one sessions and then taking them back to use in practice. I remember entering a session where I was convinced I knew what I should do regarding retirement and how. Through a couple of short guided practices and support in noticing what was deep down, I paused. The outcome was much better. I split the short-term irritations from the long-term objectives and built a much more sustainable pathway. As a result of mentoring, I'm more thoughtful and observant. I have greater compassion for others and myself. I've learned to value what my body tells me and not to rush into what my brain is telling me I must do. I think one-to-one mindfulness is a really safe place to explore, notice, and feel. I wouldn't hesitate to recommend it. It's deeply supportive. Okay, so here's person number 2. Having trained in the 8-week course and been to some graduate group sessions, I was keen to continue training when I moved abroad. It's difficult to put into words how much I've benefited from mindfulness mentoring. This year has been really challenging, with 2 bereavements and significant personal issues arising. I honestly don't know how I would have survived mentally and emotionally without the anchor of regular one-to-one sessions. It helped me navigate the challenges in a more resourceful and mindful way, suggesting mindful strategies that help me to discover a depth, strength, and compassion that we can all find even at the darkest times. In the sessions, the space is held in such a way that you feel seen and heard at a very deep level. Each session is tailored skillfully to my needs and questions. There's a depth that you work at that's not possible in regular classes. Mindfulness mentoring is great for people who need flexibility and timings to commit. It will help you take your mindfulness practice up to the next level. This is the highlight of my month. I'm so grateful, excited, and happy to be on this journey. Okay, here's person number 3. I do a lot of group mindfulness sessions and courses. Occasionally something comes up in a group that I think I benefit from exploring more personally. I booked my first one-to-one mindfulness mentoring session to gain more understanding of an extremely difficult emotional experience I was having, and hoped one-to-one might help me integrate the experience and move forward from it positively. I've had 3 sessions over a span of 4 months. Prior to my first one-to-one session, I've been severely struggling emotionally for around 6 months, following a serious breach of professional conduct and trust by a medical practitioner. I was consumed by rumination that I couldn't release myself from. I booked a one-to-one session to see if it would help me move forward. During the session, I felt acknowledged, heard, and understood, and truly validated in a way I've never experienced before in other forms of one-to-one work such as counseling and psychotherapy. My difficult feelings and ruminating thoughts melted away immediately after the session, and since then I've not been troubled by memories of the traumatic incident and have reclaimed my life. One-to-one mindfulness feels different to psychotherapy or counseling. My experience is of being met with what is present for me in the present, acknowledging, being with, instead of being offered solutions or exploring deeply into my past, being met in a compassionate, truly empathic way. A truly deep meeting of two people who for that time travel together, which feels a great privilege. Being able to have sessions ad hoc is very helpful, with group sessions being the mainstay of my guided taught experience, and one-to-one where I think it would be helpful. I mostly like to attend groups to keep costs down, but also for the interactions and community that groups allow, but appreciate being able to have one-to-one sessions when something very personal to me arises, or when something particularly emotionally strong occurs in a group or in life, or when I'd like to focus on developing a particular area or skill. I like that the person I meet with for mentoring also facilitates a number of the groups I attend, although not all of them, so knows me in a group setting. The cost is a disadvantage, but I choose to put my financial resources towards one-to-one when a group mindfulness situation, excuse me, isn't the most appropriate forum. Okay, so actually, I'm not going to read the other three because I want to also leave space for questions before we finish. But very, very briefly, I'm just going to just speak to these couple of questions, which are drawbacks. The last person mentioned the drawback of economics. So indeed, inevitably working one-to-one, there's likely to be a higher cost for the mentee and a lower revenue for the mentor, which makes it difficult in some ways for both parties to make it work. But I think there are probably things more important in life necessarily than economics, although of course recognizing that it's it is of course a factor that everybody has to take into consideration. Recognizing too that the absence of sharing of the group experience can be a drawback. In some sense, the mentor has to provide that group perspective from their own experience, and we're each only just one person. We each have our limited perspective and blind spots. So supervision and peer reflection among mentors is really, really important. And the willingness of the mentor to expose themselves to new approaches and insights and reflections. And inevitably, any new field has blind spots as well, with less research and evidence. There's really, as far as I'm aware, no research on mindfulness one-to-one approaches like this as yet. What does a mindfulness mentor need to be effective? Well, I think they need the same kinds of training that enable people to deliver group courses, because they need the same background in mindfulness approaches. But actually, I would suggest that they need in many cases, really we need a deeper degree of training and experience, because we're effectively being asked to let go of the scales, if we kind of use the analogy of music, that come with having a set curriculum, the sheet music, and be willing to play jazz and draw from our own experience and really get deeply what's needed for the person who we're working with. So actually that requires a deeper degree, I would suggest, of training, because you can't necessarily just rely, or not just, but can't rely on a course curriculum in the same way. So finally, then, what does the field need moving, the mindfulness mentoring field need going forwards? Well, I think it needs attention for perhaps research, developing of coherent models and frameworks, which I hope this is just a sort of a beginning of this presentation, to be able to enable people to share best practices and to learn and to so that field can begin to grow and mature. I think it needs adequate offerings for training and supervision for mentors, perhaps the beginnings of written training materials so that these can be shared and replicated. And also it needs some kind of promotion. So maybe, again, this is the beginning of something, to be a part of conversations, conferences, events, writings, case studies, recognizing that there is this possibility of another way of sharing mindfulness with people. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause here, recognizing we've probably got about 10 minutes or so, which I know is not long. So my apologies for taking up so much of the time. But it'd be really nice to hear any comments, questions, observations about what's been shared and about what mindfulness mentoring is, could be, isn't. So I'm really open to having a conversation with anybody who'd like to jump in.
I've got a question, if I may.
Please, would you mind saying your name, because I can't see
Oh,
it
yeah, sure.
here. So just
I didn't put my name there. Carmelo. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And my question is more about the semantics, in the sense that when I came to this, when I saw the title, in my mind, I thought a relationship of, your standard notion of mentoring, where two people are in the same profession, but you got somebody who's more experienced, who's basically offering guidance and support to a trainee. So I envision that kind of relationship. Is there any reason why you chose mentoring rather than just simply one-to-one teaching to cool?
Yeah, well, I think it rolls off the tongue nicely. Mindfulness mentoring
Sounds more sexy.
and we've not been able to come up with anything better. So this is definitely a topic that comes up, and I really get the sort of possible confusion there. And indeed, in some cases, we even use mentoring in the mindfulness field for a mentor who does exactly what you're describing. And originally the mindfulness network called this personal practice mentoring, which to my view doesn't quite roll off the tongue in the same way. But if you have any suggestions, or if anybody else has any suggestions for something that can kind of stay in the mind and isn't too much of a mouthful, that really expresses what this is, then I would love to hear it. I would also say that the mentoring, doesn't it really just mean actually a kind of a relationship of two people, maybe one of whom has practiced something for a little longer period of time and is therefore able to support the person who's maybe practiced it for a little bit less time, but without there being a kind of like heavy, kind of teacher-student thing going on. So I like the kind of lightness of mentor. I think it has a quality of sort of friendliness about it that I'm quite drawn to. So at the moment, kind of like happy to work with the confusion. Yeah, I noticed like coaching has come up in the chat, and yeah, that's certainly a possibility. I have for some reason a slight resistance to the word coaching. I don't know why. Somehow it seems quite sort of, I don't know. Yeah, it's visceral somehow for me. I can't quite explain it. But again, this is another conversation that we could have as a field. Yeah, so thank you for the comment.
Hi, Ed. It's Ken Lund. I mean, thank you for a fantastic talk. I've been rather busy of late, but I found over the last year I've had 3 people come to me for one-to-one teaching who are highly resistant to coming into a group. I think for a variety of different reasons. In one case, it was quite clear that that individual would benefit from a group, because she was beginning to realize that the problem that she thought was kind of unique to her, she would really benefit from working with a group and finding that her special problem was not that special, really. It was actually quite common. But I actually find it quite a different experience. And I usually start off with an MBSR curriculum, but then by maybe week 3, week 4, we start to diverge as I get to know the individual. So there's a different quality of relationship as a teacher coming into that sort of way of conveying mindfulness.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that, with all that you've said. Firstly, in that there are some people who might be resistant to going into a group that could really benefit from it. So totally hear that. So it's certainly, if groups are a possibility, I certainly think they're can be a really great foundation. And I, absolutely love teaching, 8-week courses and practice groups and group retreats and so on. And there can be so much, as you say, the kind of like one of the perhaps drawbacks of a one-to-one approach is it doesn't have that same quality of opening us up to, common humanity and realizing that actually my problem maybe isn't just my problem. It's not something that's special and that I'm isolated in the same way. The specifics might be, but the general processes are unlikely to be. But yeah, also similar to you, there are some people who really do not flourish in groups, and that the stress of that and the difficulty of groups can actually make it very difficult to learn in. And we don't learn well when we are, really, really stressed. We end up in the overwhelm zone, and we're too full up to take in what's being offered. So if the environment itself, the container itself, isn't helping, and another environment or container will, then isn't that wonderful to have that option, and also to have the option within that to be able to diverge from a curriculum if that's what's needed in the moment for that person, as long as they know that they're not. You haven't signed them up and said, "Oh, we're gonna do an 8-week MBSR course," and that's kind of what it was on the tin. Then I think having that flexible approach, as long as they know that that's what's happening, can be really, really valuable. Yeah. Thanks, Cam.
Oh, hi. I don't know if I can ask the question. I don't know if there's anyone else with hands up, so I don't want to butt in. So I'm just checking.
Yeah, I can't see hands, so I can only know if
okay.
you come off mute and speak, and you're the only voice I can hear at the
Okay.
moment. So do carry on.
Hi, I'm Debbie. I just wanted to try and clarify. So for me, I use mindfulness personally and in beginning to teach in a work setting. And I'm grappling with this difference between supervision and mentoring, because I know I need support in my teaching role, but I'm also really keen to, not improve, that's probably the wrong word, but, in my own personal practice. So I'm just trying to work out what's what the difference or something, or they probably overlap, I'm sure, or I don't know.
Yeah. So in the way that I'm describing mentoring, I'm not specifically talking about for example, a supervisor having a supervisory relationship with a mindfulness teacher. So where you meet with a mindfulness, a mindfulness teacher will meet with a supervisor and explore their teaching practice and what's happening in their teaching practice. Now, that may include, of course, some of what is coming up for them personally, because that might be for their teaching practice. But the focus in supervision is on the experience and the quality of their teaching and getting support with that. The way I'm describing, and the point has been also made that can be sometimes similar to what sometimes gets called mentoring when at work, when a kind of a more senior person may work with someone newer to support them in their role. The way I'm describing mentoring is simply is a mindfulness teacher, or what we would call mentor, working with someone who probably won't be a mindfulness teacher. I mean, they might be, of course, but they wouldn't be in that role here, to help them develop, deepen, be supported in cultivating mindfulness in their life through meditation practice and through bringing mindfulness to the experience of their life to help them flourish.
Okay, thank you. That's much clearer. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting the clarification. We've probably got a couple more minutes before I hand back to Belinda. So if there's anybody else who wants to come in before
I've got a very quick one. Sorry, it's me again. Because you mentioned at one point, one of your testimonials mentioned retirement. So in my mind, I thought, is there any risk, have you experienced any time of risk that it could possibly border, given that it's a one-to-one relationship, that it could possibly border into a psychotherapeutic stroke counseling sort of a intervention.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of attempted to speak to this a little bit in what I said earlier, which is that, and it is definitely a topic that we've talked about in the network mentoring group, in that if mentoring is worth its salt, then it's going to be therapeutic. Because therapeutic means, enables flexibility and transformation in people's lives and helps them to live well. But that a mentor and a mentoring relationship is focused on the key aspects of mindfulness. So that is looking at what life presents in the mind, the body, environment, and how we can meet it skillfully through the application of mindfulness practices formally and informally. Now, I don't see what could be excluded from that, in some sense, in the sort of, everything in our life, therefore, is fair game for that, because everything in life is included in what we experience and what we can notice. So if that means, for example, someone, working with, decisions about retirement or life stages and transformations, choices about what they choose to give their attention to in their life, then that's relevant to mindfulness mentoring. What distinguishes it is the clear, definition of what the approach is, and that we don't kind of pretend to be, psychoanalytic therapists, or don't pretend to be, someone who's trained in another approach. But I think we can be confident, that a deep training in mindfulness can be therapeutic. So, in some sense, for me, the sort of distinctions aren't a problem. But certainly we don't want to be confused. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
I definitely think it would help to have, more support and more structures around, helping this to be offered, in a way that's safe and supportive for people. Just as in the same way that all the supports and structures around group mindfulness teaching have evolved over the last decades. I think that's really important and helpful, and how they have a course around, offerings of psychotherapy. But I mean, when something is new and different, then that has to evolve over time. So I think I better stop. And hand back to Belinda, because I think, Belinda, you've got a few slides to share with everyone before we finish. But I just want to say thank you for all being here and listening, and I hope it's been interesting.